I'm building an open source tech stack for creating and self-hosting multiplayer VR worlds that I call the Brane. I've been developing Brane Engine off and on for around 3 years now, but I recently made the decision to go all in and make it my focus. When I did that, I realized that while I've been making content about this project for as long as it's been going on, I've never fully explained why I'm building it and what exactly the Brane project is. At least not all in one place. And that's what I'm going to do with this video. It's my goal that after you're finished watching through, you'll come out of this with the same mental picture that I have, and also see why I'm so passionate about this project, and no matter how long it takes or how hard it is, I'm going to see it through. When you hear the term virtual reality, what does it mean to you? If you like going outside, you might see it as a waste of time, but you were recommended this video either by a friend or by the algorithm, so I'm gonna assume that you at least see the potential. And I'm not even talking about the current landscape of VR, because while it is objectively in the best place that it's ever been, thanks largely in part to the insane amount of investment that Meta's been throwing at it for the last couple of years, to be honest, the vibes of the current market are iffy at best. But let's go back to around 2017 through 2019. This is when I first got into VR. The Ready Player One movie just came out. You're watching videos on the Node channel about this demo game being built by Stress Level Zero with really realistic gun physics. You're also seeing stuff about these weird fully finger-tracked controllers straight from Valve. This dude called Thrillseeker started putting out weekly Tuesday Newsdays that strangely only happen on days that aren't a Tuesday. And John Carmack still works at Oculus. The vibes are immaculate. Everybody is just really hyped about what this new technology can bring, and the hype was rewarded for a time. We got amazing PC VR titles like Boneworks, Lone Echo, Stormland, a first-party Half-Life game. The headsets were rapidly getting better as well. We went from the HTC Vive with controllers that look like this, to the Valve Index with controllers that look like this. And when the pandemic hit in 2020, it skyrocketed VR. Can't hang out with your friends in person? Here's a pretty good substitute. And around this time was also when I started experimenting with the idea of creating my own engine, mostly because I wanted to. But right after that was when things started getting a little weird. A little meta. Remember NFTs? Yes, I know, I'm sorry for researching that era, but it's an important part of the story. Even to this day, VR and crypto are still grouped together underneath a term that was popularized during that era called the metaverse. Now, the term metaverse had already been around before that. It had a different feeling. Back in June of that year was when I had first started work on this thing I was calling Brane Engine, which in the videos I made about it back then, I would commonly describe it as a metaverse engine. And back then, when you thought metaverse, you thought Snow Crash and Ready Player One and various other franchises. You didn't think cryptocurrencies. So I was pretty annoyed when 4 months after I started, Facebook comes out, rebrand themselves to Meta, and now they own the term metaverse. And the vision they push for is rather uncompelling. Now what most people think about as the metaverse is people in Disney ripoff avatars trading JPEGs of monkeys using currencies named after a dog meme that's totally not just a legally obfuscated pump and dump scheme. Now, not only am I not able to call my thing what it is because it has connotations, but now I'm also worried about the future of VR spaces. I like VR chat, but even to this day, they have not solved their funding issues, and I'm worried they have to go corporate at some point if they haven't already to solve those issues. Alt Space got straight up dropped by Microsoft. Horizon World. Neos ended up blowing up due to some crypto stuff. And watching all of this, I realized, hey, I'm a pretty good VR dev. I can make a game engine. I can even make scripting languages. This is one area of my life where I can step up and I can be the change I want to see in the world. And I've already been at work at something which I could theoretically grow and nurture into the thing that I think the VR community needs to both survive and break into the mainstream. Let's step back for a second and look at the main players in the multiplayer VR space. Why do I think we need something new? From my perspective, each one falls short in at least one one of 4 categories. And to be clear, that doesn't mean these platforms are a failure. I'm just trying to articulate why I think they either haven't reached mass adoption or can't sustain it if they do. These categories, as I see them, are the creator experience, the user experience, the cultural experience, and who controls that platform. I think Resonite, previously Neos, is the closest thing we have, at least technical capabilities-wise, to a true metaverse. They have everything a hardcore user could possibly want. Support for every enthusiast hardware device you can imagine, cutting-edge technologies like Gaussian splats. In fact, the main developer of this platform, Fruxus, has been going around and stealing parts of the real world into the platform, and that has been really fun to watch. They have an in-game node scripting system for both worlds and avatars, which is the coolest thing ever, because you can have a group of friends all group around your avatar or the thing you're building, and everybody can just collaboratively show each other how to do things, and is just how things should be. And then to build on top of that, they have a cross-world inventory system where you can bring items from one world into any other world. But I think that's where it's going to be held back. Not technically, but culturally. I personally think it's impossible for a world creator to curate an immersive experience for their players if at any point a person can bring out their 50 BMG, shoot it, and then teleport to the surface they've shot. Or if one of your players can pull their magic cappuccino out of their bag that will turn you into a furry if you drink it. And those are the tame things that platform can do. I think for a platform to take off, it needs to have the technical capability to allow people to do these things, but it also needs to let world creators selectively turn that off when it makes sense for that world. Now, this isn't a dig at Resonite, because I don't think they're building something for a broader audience, and the systems that they have work great for the audience that they do have. I just don't think I'm one of those users. VR chat is the closest culture-wise by far. Now, I'm not saying that all of VR chat culture is great. I'm just saying that certain subcultures within VR chat are the closest thing we have to people natively living inside of VR. There's a fair number of people who regularly sleep inside of this game. There's people that have full relationships, and I mean full. There's live shows of all different varieties. There's even multi-world international conferences. Shout out to VCAT! Go to VCAT if you haven't. If you want to see the full potential of multiplayer VR, go to VCAT, especially if you're a business person. You can't say you know what you're talking about in VR if you haven't been to VCAT. There's even some simple, if very glitchy games. They do end up turning more into self-paced, slightly interactive 3D movies, or held back to the extent of party game. And that's because VR chat is rather limited for creators. I say that from the perspective of an experienced game developer, where when I want to do something, I just boot up a game engine and I'm able to do that thing in a relatively straightforward way. In VR chat, on the other hand, the scripting is rather limited, and you're also further limited to only world scripts. Avatars have zero scripting capabilities whatsoever. Now, the community gets around this by pulling straight up magic with shaders, but I can't really count that as you can do this in VR chat. Well, technically yes, but you need to be an absolute god at shader scripting to be able to do it. And if you need to know the ancient forgotten runes of Unity shader scripting to be able to do something that with a proper scripting system would be laughably easy, that's not good enough for me. It's just gotta be easier than that. Roblox is interesting because they have a custom engine, they have VR support, and they have a massive player base. I'm not one of those players, so I can't speak too much about it because I don't have any personal experience, but when I've described the architecture of what I'm building in the past, I have had it compared to Roblox. From what I can tell, it is the closest thing to what I'm building that already exists. But if they want to become the metaverse, they definitely have an image problem. I look at most Roblox gameplay and I think that just looks childish, and 12-year-old me thought that. Also not the biggest fan of what I've heard of their monetization schemes, and I'm also illogically not the biggest fan of Lua, because I am a statically typed language enjoyer. It's better than JavaScript by far, that's for sure. And on the topic of JavaScript, I have some controversial takes on WebXR, because I've had some experience with it. I even worked at a WebXR focused startup for a good while, Wonderland Engine. And I'm gonna be honest, even with that first-hand experience, I don't see it as a strong contender for the metaverse, at least in my eyes. Not Wonderland in particular, those guys are awesome, and they know what they're doing, at least from the technical side of things, as well as being a very strong contender for the favorite startup that I've worked for. I'm talking more about WebXR as a whole. There's a technical side that I'll go into more details on later, but there's also a cultural problem. Even though it's the web, the experiences don't feel like they're connected, and it's also kind of hard to find them. Maybe this can be solved with a bigger marketing budget, and maybe it's also that I'm just not really in the spaces that are talking about them, but I just never saw any WebXR experiences except when I was working for a startup where it was my job to seek those out and see how the technology that we were developing was being used. Actually, no, I can't think of one industry that has embraced it for a pretty good use case, but that's outside the age range of this video. Honorable mention to Second Life. It watched so we could run, but it seems a little dead right now, at least to my uninitiated eyes. Some people might also put something like Fortnite here. No, but that's enough yapping about the problems with things that people like. Let's talk about why and how I want to make something better. Of course, when I start thinking about what my ideal platform would look like, I take inspiration from the regulars, like SAO, Ready Player One, but while I am inspired by the technical side of things, I'm most inspired by the feelings that I get while reading or watching these. And even though these are the more popular VR franchises, they're not even my favorites. If I had to pick my favorite, that would have to be the Mortality Doctrine series by James Dashner, who you may know as the author of the Maze Runner series. To give a brief overview, because I'm not sure anybody other than myself even knows that this series exists, it's set after the events of Maze Runner, after society has had the chance to rebuild. And almost everybody has this coffin-like fold-eyed VR device that allows them to connect to something called the VertNet, a fully immersive, interconnected world of not only games, but also schools, offices, and even restaurants. And my favorite part of the whole series is that when you close your eyes, you can see all of the code around you flowing and shifting, and you can even reach out and manipulate it. And this is a core part of the entire series. Put simply, the main magic system throughout the entire thing is the VR equivalent of Control-Shift-I. I can remember being as young as 14 and wanting to make a browser-based MMO where it's essentially that. The main magic system is you would create spells using code and then be able to cast those. That's probably also why I like building scripting languages now. But yeah, it's kind of inevitable that I would attempt to build something like this. More recently, as you can probably tell, I've also been inspired pretty heavily by the vibes of Tron Legacy. There's not really any hard tech there to copy. I'm not going to try to make a laser that sucks people into a game. That's a little bit outside of my domain of expertise, but the vibe and aesthetic are just amazing. And yeah, this cloak is going on 3 years old, and it's barely holding on. So when I started planning out what my virtual platform is going to look like, I started with the capabilities of the Oasis, the creator experience of the VertNet, and the vibes and visuals of the grid. This is why I chose the name Brane Engine, spelt B-R-A-N-E, short for membrane. Branes are a concept from string theory, one example of being our entire universe, which would qualify as a 3D brain. So by calling the platform I'm creating the brain, I'm trying to invoke the image of it being an actual surface that you're building your stuff on top of. I also want to support lots of multi-threading and a node scripting system at some point, so there's a lot of symbolism of threads and strings, and also when you say the brain, it sounds a little bit like the grid. But again, why build an entire engine and server stack instead of just using something that already exists? All the way back in 2021, I came up with a vision for what I think the VR platform of the future should be able to do at the bare minimum. The scenario plays out like this. I'm booting up my VR setup to go do something with a group of friends. I'm probably not the first one, so I get picked up by them. I imagine every world has some form of either doorway or way to create a doorway that leads to a virtual subway system. When I'm finally logged onto the game, I navigate to the nearest doorway or just create one near me. After I do that, my friend group, who is probably already on this train, would arrive at that doorway and the doors would open and I would see them standing there. I would walk in, the doors would close behind me, and then we would zoom around picking up the other people in the group before going off to whatever game we eventually want to play. The beauty of the train car is that it's a hidden loading screen. While we all sit around downloading the content for what's outside the door, we can still talk, interact, and our avatars are fully functional. And that's really important. There's never anything to break your immersion. There's no loading screens, and the group never gets split up. This is a physical reality where you can travel fast, but it is still traveling and it feels like it. This world's something where you get the feeling that everything is real and tangible. The core goal of Brane Engine is to make that vision in particular a reality, or condensed down even smaller, completely eliminate the loading screen from multiplayer VR. And originally, when researching the technical hurdles for that, I wasn't planning on making my own engine. When you build a traditional game, doesn't matter the framework, engine, or end platform, generally the approach that you use is you put all of your art, animations, textures, models, basically everything visual, and then you tie that together with some scripts, you build that out, optimize it, and then package all of that into one archive that then gets sent off to wherever your game is being distributed from. Everything that could be possibly experienced in one zip file. But then you look at any platform that has user-generated content like VR chat, Resonite, Roblox, and even the web. A key difference emerges. They're not loading content off of your computer, they're loading content off of a server. And what I found quickly is that modern engines don't have a solution for this. They have things approaching it, but they fall short. I'm not super sure what's happening over in Unreal Land, but from my understanding, they have streaming from disk down really well. But the instant you want to stream from somewhere that's not your computer, then you're fresh out of luck. Unity is much closer with both asset bundles and more recently addressables, but both of those systems have one fatal flaw. They don't support scripting. You can put as many visual assets in there as you want, but the instant you want to tell them what to do, you're completely on your own. This basically left me with two options: create my own engine, or work around another engine systems and try to add in a safe and efficient way to run external code. Honorable mentions go to WebXR and WebAssembly, but there's a number of reasons that I'll go over later to why I didn't choose them. I chose to build my own engine because with a clean slate, I can prioritize things that don't make sense for other engines to prioritize. And I can also start with fresh ideas sparked after those engines were first architected, and just in general build something that fits what I need a lot better. I have an extensive wish list of technical things that I want to create, but more importantly, how do I solve the problems that I brought up for other VR platforms? First and most importantly, who is in control? This is the most important category for me. In my mind, the people creating the worlds should be the ones in ultimate control of those worlds. That's why I'm building the core of Brane Engine completely open source underneath the Apache 2.0 license. A common line you hear in startups is build something that you yourself would buy. And I've always struggled buying anything software related. Partially because I've always been broke, but also because I just don't value static code that much. Like, what do you mean the software that they're not doing anything to other than the occasional bug fix is pulling in an 80% profit margin? Like, that's wild. That's almost offensive to me. In this economy, I understand if somebody is providing a service of some sort, and I'll charge for labor and upkeep costs all day, but I'm just not in a place where I'm comfortable charging for a static piece of software right now. Maybe that's why I'm broke. Okay, but where does the money come from then? Funding for the core platform should come from the people using and creating on top of that platform, not from venture capital. One of the things I've realized while working in the startup space, that the customer is who the money is coming from. If that money is coming from an investor, then your customer ceases to be your theoretical non-existent customers. It is now that investor. If you're a publicly traded company, your job is to keep your equity high, and you do that by making your shareholders happy. nowhere in there is make a good product a direct goal. The direct goal is make as much money as possible. And you just have to hope that make a good product aligns with that, because a lot of times it actually doesn't. On the other hand, if I take the path of exclusively community funding, now my job is to make you guys happy. And the best way to do that is by making a genuinely good product. Now, I might take funding for other things after the core of the engine is in a good enough place that I can build stuff on top of it. And even then, the investment wouldn't be for the core of the engine, it would be for that thing that I'm building on top of it, like a game. And eventually, I want to provide a managed hosting service, where I would take care of the job of hosting service for you instead of you having to self-host, but without taking that option away. And those things make a lot more sense as a fundable endeavor, even though I still would like to avoid corporate funding if possible. The other huge reason that the Brane Engine is self-hosting first is because it frees up the creator to not be beholden to the interests of a larger corporation. You are in control and nobody can take that away from you. Second, the culture. I think that the culture of virtual spaces is very much mishandled. VR adoption is a cultural issue at this point. Yes, the hardware could be better. The software could definitely be better, but both of them are already pretty good. I mean, most people under the age of 30 that are on the internet have heard of VR chat, and its reputation isn't great, and I'm sure you can guess why. Headsets stay on shelves and dressers not because they aren't good, but because the people that have bought them can't find a virtual community that consistently brings them back in. And brands don't invest in VR because it's just a straight up risk if they can't sanitize everything. At least in the West. Japan has something completely different going on. Vika shout out! At my last job, I worked very closely with a team building the virtual Burning Man experience. And anybody that's worked with burners knows they will eventually get you to go to Burning Man. And they got me to go to Burning Man. And let me tell you, that is the closest I've ever gotten to the feeling of VR chat without a headset on. Side note, VR Camp 2025 is happening. We're going to figure out a way to do it. It's going to happen. But going back to the virtual burn experience, it was originally built on top of AltSpace. And AltSpace... It was originally built on top of AltSpace. And AltSpace, as we all know, was left by Microsoft in the dust. Dust. Get it, dust. And after that happened, they had to figure out where they would move to. And they tried out a lot of different options, and I remember them specifically addressing VR chat. It was the culture of that platform that made it not viable for what they wanted to create. And that is a crazy wake-up call, because burners are pretty crazy. And that brings me to a very important question. Can normies, corpos, anime girls, and furries all exist in harmony? Nice voice crack. Can normies, corpos, anime girls, and furries all exist in harmony and peace before the Troll Nation attacks? And I think the answer has to be yes. I believe for a platform to truly become the metaverse, it needs to let people echo chamber themselves a little bit. By which I mean, the platform can't have just one culture. Worlds need to be able to enforce a dress code if they want. I mean, if they don't want their managers showing up in a booth avatar, that's their loss. But it's their choice to make. And I think that's how you get a platform where hardcore users and large corporations can exist in the same interconnected space. You let large corporations do their thing and enforce business casual and human avatars. But the instant you step over that barrier, you morph back into your preferred appearance. Culture is also one of the main reasons why I've never considered a native crypto integration. To be honest, the sales pitch of many crypto projects fits what I'm trying to build very well, at least from a technical perspective. But the instant you look at it from the cultural perspective, it fails instantly. The instant you center a platform around monetary gain, you tend to scare away all of the creatives that are necessary to create the content that's good and engaging and actually art. Now, I've actually had genuine conversations with people attempting to convince me to put crypto into this project, and the main point that they made was, it gets you in the room with people that would fund your project. And of course, that is the main draw of the crypto community, is how loaded with money they are. And sure, with money, it's super easy to keep what you're building afloat, but keep what afloat? I mean, we've all seen how little even millions of dollars of funding will do for crypto projects. They still turn out pretty bad. And that's a cultural thing. That's not to say I don't want creators to monetize. Quite the contrary. The way that assets are going to be set up is the creators of those assets will have ultimate control over how their assets are distributed and how people are authorized to use them. I mean, if you're hosting the server that your assets are stored on, and the code of how people are authenticated to be able to download those assets is open source, I literally can't stop you from choosing to do that however you want. So it's up to you. You could even add a crypto-based transaction system to the way that you sell your assets, but it's not a platform-wide thing, it's a choice that you get to make. And that transitions nicely into the next category, the creator experience. And as a programmer myself, I focus a lot on the coding aspect. I love writing scripting languages, so I am building one for this. The main goal of this custom language is to make runtime loaded code very easily multi-threadable, and I have a full video on that over here that you could go watch to see the ways that I'm trying to innovate that. But suffice it to say, we're going to be throwing scripts on everything. Worlds, avatars, your dog. I also have longer term plans for a node editor, both 2D and VR, but that is much longer term, and that transitions into VR native editing. My goal is to make the VR version of the editor at parity or better than the 2D version. In fact, I would love to be able to code the engine from inside the engine itself, but that is a many years off in the future sort of thing. Right now, I just need to get anything to work. Control of users and culture within worlds. I've touched on this in several other sections already, but one of my hotter takes is if you're in somebody's world, they get to decide what sort of experience they want you to have. There's a common game dev saying, players will optimize the fun out of anything. So if our platform is going to allow people to bring in completely custom avatars with fully fleshed out scripts and potentially even items, there also needs to be a way for worlds to selectively turn those features off. Otherwise, the trolling is going to be insane. For a current real example, in VR chat, when venues have live music events, it is very common for them to have either a volunteer or even paid staff going around and manually policing people's avatars. So if somebody is in a crazy unoptimized avatar or something with a screen space shader that's just meant to troll everybody, they go and either kindly ask that person to change into another avatar, or if needed, completely kick them from the instance. But that entire interaction could be completely avoided if world creators were able to set standards and filters for the avatars allowed within their worlds. And of course, this can be as fine-grained as you want it to be. You could have something like a manual or rules-based system where certain people in the instance would be able to have a little bit more freedom on their avatars, like staff or the performers. I don't know what the VR chat backend looks like, but from my perspective, that should be an incredibly easy thing to implement, especially because they already have an avatar rating system. The only reason I can think of that they haven't done something like this already would be for a non-technical social reason. For a more theoretical example, imagine a world that had a competitive game inside of it, and this world wants to provide a selection of pre-made characters, perhaps aligning to something like a class system. It makes sense for that world to be able to limit players to only use those avatars. Or if another pandemic hits and we're all forced to work from home again, people might work in a virtual office, and it makes sense for something like a virtual office to have a manual whitelist of the avatars that they would allow their staff to use. And you can imagine working that people would submit the avatar that they wish to use within that space, and then after approval they would be able to use it. It just prevents something like Ugandan Knuckles incident. And finally, but definitely not least, the user experience. This one kind of overlaps a little bit with the creator experience because self-expression is an incredibly important part of what makes VR platforms special. For a platform to be truly successful, it needs to allow people to create an avatar that represents the version of themselves that they want to portray to others, and also select that appearance based on the context of the worlds that they're within. Potentially, this even means letting people pre-select which avatars they want to use in which worlds. So you can use your crazy kitted out avatar in social and private worlds that you yourself have created, but then when you go into a more corporate environment, you have your toned down avatar that they will actually allow into that space that doesn't scare the normies off. And that ties into the next part, immersion. A big part of why I want to build a custom engine is to drastically raise the standard of multiplayer VR in particular ways that are only possible with the custom engine. Performance. Current engines struggle at multi-threading. Most game engines nowadays were originally built back in the days where most computers only had a dual or quad core CPU. And nowadays, my personal machine has 32. And while modern engines are trying to adapt to be more multi-threaded, they're having to multi-thread system by system and also convince developers to individually choose which systems they want to multi-thread. On my side though, I am attempting to build with multi-threading as my main concern, to the extent of even writing a custom scripting language to make it easier for developers. I have 32 cores. I am going to use all of them. This will be beneficial to the Quest client as well, because that still is in the realm of 4 threads. But I also want my engine to be a platform on which people can truly push the boundaries of PC VR without having to rely on a dedicated engine. And another one of those ways I want to push the boundaries is better spatial audio support. One of the things that gets me into VR regularly is live music events. So I want to give those events a way to make themselves even better. And a really easy way to do that is to give them access to a sound API like Steam Audio. Now, I might end up going with something different, but Steam Audio is currently what I'm looking at. And finally, but definitely not least, ease of use and accessibility. This will be an as-we-go sort of thing. I know some people who are very passionate about this, so I'm going to be consulting with them and getting their advice on this subject. But one of the core complaints with a lot of platforms, especially VRChat and especially Resonate, is that the UI just kind of sucks. So that's definitely something that we need to fix. I don't know quite how to yet, but it's definitely one of my goals. And on the accessibility side of things, I am a VR power user. I want to be able to use haptic gloves, haptic vests, full body tracking, omnidirectional treadmills, the works. And the way that I want to support those is to provide an API for people to connect portions of their avatar in the input system directly into third-party scripts and applications. As a side effect of that, you can imagine connecting any accessibility device to that system as well. Basically just any device you want. Looking at that list, you need more than just a game engine. You need a full tech stack, and what sounds a lot like a web browser. The web as a whole has a lot in common with the ideal metaverse. URLs describe your location, there's a pretty secure scripting system, and with WebXR, it already natively supports VR. Sounds perfect, why don't I just use that? Put simply, I loathe web technologies with a burning passion. More specifically, anything that has JavaScript associated with it. I look at that language and anything built on top of it, and I see 30 years of tech debt that nobody can touch because it would break the entire internet if they did. I mean, I might eventually be able to get away with using WebAssembly only, but that day is pretty far off. And to address both WebXR and WebAssembly at the same time, both are developed by a committee that are then implemented by vendors. And standards suck when you're in unmapped waters, especially in VR. What if I want to support full body tracking, haptic gloves, treadmills, etc.? I'm a PC VR power user, and I want all of those things. And I don't think I'm going to get those if I'm trapped in a web browser. At least not consistently. And that's because whatever workarounds implemented by one world to be able to connect to those devices wouldn't work in every world. But if you had your own custom client instead, you could then implement support for those devices on the client and plugin side of things. And now it works with all of the worlds. But I don't think that's something that a standards committee is thinking about anytime soon. So instead, I basically decided to reinvent the web browser from scratch, discarding the parts of it that I loathe, but still keeping the parts of it that are useful. So what does this look like when we draw out the whole picture? The Brane Engine is split into 5 main parts: a client, an editor, asset servers, runtime servers, and a database login system. Since I'm building all of these completely open source, you will be able to set up your own servers to host your own world, but then users will be able to visit both your world and other worlds with a common client seamlessly. But how is that jumping from world to world going to work? How are we going to get that without a single loading screen anywhere? How do you let one person standing in one world hosted on one set of servers walk seamlessly over the boundary to another world hosted on another set of servers seamlessly? You change the way you think about how content is organized. Most game engines have the concept of a scene, much like a play where the audience waits in darkness in between scenes where the curtains close and then the stage crew reorients the assets or props. A scene-based engine is built around the idea that there are clean and hard breaks between different disparate pieces of content. Instead, what I'm doing is building Brane Engine around the idea that everything is made out of separately downloadable modular assets. This includes textures, materials, shaders, meshes, animations, scripts, and the assemblies or prefabs that describe how all of those things they interact with each other. Each one of those things is going to be independently downloadable, all the way up to worlds being built out of modular chunks. You can imagine a chunk as a room in a building or a field in a forest, really just any arbitrary polygon of space that a world creator wants it to be, whatever makes sense for what they're building. So as you walk throughout a world, it's not one scene, but instead a net of smaller puzzle pieces, where each puzzle piece works completely fine on its own, letting other puzzle pieces load and unload around you as makes sense. The level of detail is a huge part of this as well. If you don't want to or just straight up can't download the texture that somebody is using on, say, their avatar, you should be able to set a setting on your client to limit the max you download to something like a downscaled 2K version. And if you're walking through a large world, you shouldn't need to download the entire thing. Instead, you just really care about what's closest to you, and then everything else in the far distance, in a lot of cases, can get away with just a 2D plane. And because of this architecture, it would allow us to progressively swap out a higher version of that entire area or even individual assets. And when you're creating these world chunks, they won't be limited to only downloading assets from the same server that they're on. So when building a world, it would be theoretically possible for you to link one of your chunks to a chunk in a different world hosted on a different server, effectively creating a bridge between them. To a player walking through their world, their computer doesn't care which server things are on. So from their perspective, this chunk that they're standing on looks pretty similar to that chunk over there, even though they're hosted from 2 completely different places, and they should be able to just walk over. This is how I imagine that train between realities working. When you create a world, if you want to be a part of that system, all you would need to do is obtain a link to the asset describing the door, or an entire station, or perhaps there's even a way to customize that to make it fit into the context of your world. But that all aside, you pull this external asset into your world, then it just magically works. And boom, if you haven't noticed, I just described a VR search engine, but it's disguised as an entire subway train that you can ride around with your friends. Sound like a lot? That's because it is. But I'm very confident that I will eventually pull this off. Keyword there being eventually. I've been working on this on and off for 3 years already, and I'm both expecting and wanting this to become my life's work. So, I have all the time in the world. That's the how and why of the engine. But what does the timeline of all of this look like? When will you, the viewer, be able to download the engine and get to creating? I'm aiming for roughly 4 to 6 months from now to be when I'm able to start putting out cohesive demos and experiences, with the idea being that every couple of months I'll put something out that is slightly better than the last, along with hopefully creating a monthly meetup group for both supporters and contributors. But realistically, it's going to be years until any of this is stable to build something real with. That's not to say you can't already build what I have hosted on GitHub, but There's not any scripting implemented in that yet, so it'll look pretty. I have PBR, but I want to be extremely clear. This is a long-term project with long-term goals. And I hope you want to watch and even support the journey. If you want to make this a reality, the easiest thing you can do is just share this video with anyone you think would find it interesting. And also tell YouTube you want to see more of this with all of the fancy buttons down there for that purpose. The biggest thing you can do to help me is help me fund all of this. I've been doing everything from building websites to building fences, and that takes a lot of time away from working on this, when ideally it would be my main focus. The best way to do that is through the Ko-Fi link in the description below. All you get right now is a gold name in the Engine Discord, which you can also find a link for in the description, but this will also be the way that you access the monthly meetup group and alpha tester group that I want to set up eventually. With that, I am signing off for now. This is the third time that I've filmed this entire script, and both times it has taken me 2 hours. So I am happy to hopefully be done with it this time. Definitely try to check out one of my coding streams. I temporarily paused them while filming this video just because it was taking so long. But if you want to watch me work on all of this live and ask whatever questions you want, I am very happy to answer all of them and even give you a tour of the codebase if you ask really nicely. Then that is the place to do so. With that, until next time, I will see you around. And when the and we